Hello guys, welcome back to history. We have been talking about the United States expanding, growing westward. We talked about the Louisiana Purchase and how the US got that territory that was owned by France. That's now part of the United States. And so we're going to continue to talk about the US taking over these areas of land in North America that are not currently owned by the United States. So the US is growing pretty rapidly too. And it's getting stronger. People are moving out west, but Spain has control still of basically all that is Mexico up to California and Texas and Florida. So today we're going to look at how Spain loses some of that land to Mexico and then how Mexico loses some of that land to the United States, particularly Texas. Now, this building we're going to be talking about, this building, if you don't know, this is called the Alamo, and it was a very famous mission that was the site of one of the more prominent battles in Texas fighting for their independence. All right, so let's begin. So here's how Texas came to be under the control of the Mexican government to start. So Mexico fought for its independence from Spain in 1821 and they won it. And so in order to expand their land and settle their land, basically what happened is that a lot of the Spanish people who were living in the areas that Mexico won chose to leave. Obviously the two don't get along, so why would they want to stay? Or they got kicked out. So the Mexican government wants people to come and settle in their lands, especially the land in Texas. There's lots of open land, big open land. It's good for ranchers and farmers, things like that. So the Mexican government offers up these land grants for Mexican citizens to go and live in Texas. So they're basically offering up all of this free land for people to move there, which is great. The problem is that not only Mexican settlers went to live in Texas. A lot of the settlers that came over were actually American citizens moving west. And this leads to tension between the American settlers and the Mexican settlers. Okay. One American settler named Stephen F. Austin, which you might recognize his last name as Austin, Texas. He convinced like 300 Americans to come over with him and settle in Texas. And so you have this like merging of the Mexican settlers and the American settlers, and they don't get along. They don't have the same viewpoints on government. They don't have the same viewpoints on land ownership. And there's just a lot of tension between the two groups of people. So by 1830, Mexico tries to stop Americans from settling in Texas. The Mexican government is worried. They are afraid that, too many Americans on their land is going to mean that Mexico is going to lose that land, which is a relevant fear because it's happened before. America is powering through, growing and expanding their country. And so the government tries to dissuade the Americans from settling on their land by, wanting them to pay more taxes. And if this sounds a little like deja vu from British Parliament, then it sort of is. But the problem is that doesn't stop people from coming over and settling in Texas. It just leads to more tension and more anger, to the point where this ultimately erupts in Texas fighting for their independence from Mexico, which means there are enough American settlers living in Texas to do this. So in 1836, Americans living in Texas, and some Mexicans too, honestly, who wanted to break free from the Mexican government, sign the Texas Declaration of Independence. So basically what the Americans did back in 1776, declaring independence from England, now what we would consider the state of Texas, it's not a state yet, but that area of land is now declaring independence from Mexico. Not necessarily that they want to join the US, they just want to be free from the control of the Mexican government. So the Texans decide they no longer want to be governed by Mexico, and Sam Houston, another name you might recognize, Houston, Texas, Sam Houston is chosen as the commander of the Texas Army. So Sam Houston is to Texas what George Washington was to the colonies. Okay, so there are some similarities here. So in 1836, Texas has declared themselves free from Mexico. Now, this is also a big undertaking, like it was for the colonies declaring independence from England. Texas does not necessarily have the backing and support of the American armed forces and Navy. This is just like the settlers of Texas going up against the Mexican army. So this is a big undertaking and one that is going to be a tough fight. Now, that's not to say they didn't get some outside help, but it wasn't like the US government came flocking over to help them in defeating the Mexican army. So there's lots of back and forth, but one of the most prominent battles that takes place is March 6th, 1836, when the Mexican army defeats the Texans at the Alamo. Now, the Alamo was this old mission, and basically what happens is General Santa Anna, who is the general of the Mexican army, yes, like Santa Ana, California, he wants to keep Texas for Mexico. Obviously, he's leader of the Mexican army. And so he leads 5,000 Mexican soldiers to basically surround the Alamo, this mission. And inside this mission are around 180 Texas or Americans that are holed up in this Alamo. And it's men, women, and children in this Alamo. And the Americans do their best to hold off the Mexican army. But when you have 180 people going up against 5,000 trained soldiers, the odds are not in your favor. And these are normal people. This would have been like a militia army, like Minutemen from the Revolutionary War. So these are not necessarily, trained soldiers that are holed up in this Alamo. So they manage to hold them off for 13 days. But eventually they're going to run out of ammunition. They're going to start running out of food, water. It's going to be lots of problems. So General Santa Anna basically just has to be patient and know that ultimately he will get his opportunity to go in and, take over this Alamo. So after 13 days, it's basically just a slaughtering on the people that are inside the Alamo. All of the Americans, except for a few women and children, were, if they didn't die in the battle, they were executed afterwards as prisoners. And so it was just a horrible slaughtering of a horrible defeat of the Americans for this. But it sparked in people this hope that the Americans that were living in Texas could ultimately win. And remember, the Alamo kind of became their battle cry because it was such a horrible loss that it kind of fueled their passion for wanting to be victorious over the Mexican army. Because, it would have been bad if it was just a bunch of men in the Alamo, but people really get angry when a bunch of innocent women and children are also a casualty of war like this. So before we go any further, let's watch this quick little video. It kind of goes into more detail about the significance of the Alamo.
The reason the Alamo arrests our attention and has attracted the attention of generations of Americans ever since it happened is, at its core, very simple. It's a battle in which everybody dies.
Well, the Alamo is an interesting saga in American frontier development, American independence, war with our neighboring nation, Mexico.
Texas is a province of Mexico, and a rebellious province of Mexico, even before the Americans had arrived. And the Mexican army is coming back to reclaim its territory. It considers that the Americans are either invaders, if they came to aid the rebellion, or traitors if they were settlers there who had pledged their allegiance to Mexico.
And there in this Alamo, the old mission, the Americans hold up. About 100 of them, they get some reinforcements. And the famous people in American history that we know about that's so associated with the Alamo, Davy Crockett and Colonel Travis and Jim Bowie.
At the Alamo, you have one of these American citizen armies, volunteer armies, only 186 some odd guys, defending this outpost against an army of thousands, hoping for aid, hoping for rescue, and ultimately recognizing that they're going to be disappointed in their hope of rescue.
This is the imagery that most Americans have, that they were overrun by these brutal Mexican forces and killed.
Great tragic losses are always more compelling, more dramatic than great victories, in part because they bring us face to face with something that's going to happen to all of us. We're going to die. The Alamo, in its day, gave them a moral cause. And so they raced into subsequent battles saying, remember the Alamo. And of course, Texans have been remembering the Alamo ever since.
The Alamo is part of American culture, the most widely visited historical site in the state of Texas, and in a sense, kind of an icon in American history of the mid-19th century.
So, going into future battles, the phrase "remember the Alamo" kind of fueled their resolve, and it motivated them to want to try to do better. Like, remember all that bad stuff that happened at the Alamo, where everybody died and it was a total disaster and nobody came to help us, but we managed to hold them off for, almost like a week and a half. But let's remember what we're fighting for, to not let that happen again. And so they would ride into these battles against the Mexican army shouting, remember the Alamo. And it kind of was a way to pump them up and motivate them and help them to remember this cause that they were fighting for. So in April of 1836, General Santa Anna is defeated by Sam Houston and the Texas Army. This is one of those battles they rode in. They were shouting, remember the Alamo. It was super patriotic because they ended up winning this battle. And it ultimately starts to lead to the time when General Santa Anna is captured and ultimately then is forced to surrender, which gives Texas its independence. Now, the surrendering and the capturing didn't all happen on April 21st of 1836, but this, you could kind of say, was a turning point in the war for Texas independence. And so ultimately what ends up happening is that General Santa Anna surrenders and Texas gains its independence. Now, Texas does not immediately become part of the United States. There are some concerns from the US government over Texas becoming a state for a few reasons. One, the government was afraid that because Texas is so close to Mexico, that there could be another war. And the American government is like, we just came out of the War of 1812. We don't really have the funds or the resources, nor do we want to be involved in a war with another country, right? The US is still just trying to expand their nation and maintain control and continue to grow and get stronger. They're not out like the countries in Europe looking to conquer all the land. They just want to do their own thing and have everybody leave them alone for the time being. So they don't want to get in war with Mexico. But also, you have this issue of slavery, okay? The majority of the states in the South are slave states, while the states in the North are free states. So it becomes Texas is a southern state. Do we add it to the Union as a slave state and then have all the states in the North protest it? If we add it as a free state in the South, then all the southern states are going to protest. So it kind of, for a while, became easier for the US government to just ignore Texas and not give it a statehood, not allow it to become a state. Now, that ultimately changes in 1845 when President Polk decides to make Texas a state, and it joins as a slave state, which is obviously going to cause some problems with the states in the North. So it's kind of one of those things that no matter how Texas was added as a state, it was going to cause problems and tensions within the United States. So now that doesn't mean that obviously adding it as a slave state was the right choice to make, because there should not have been any slave states at this point. But the tensions over states being slave states or free states is part of what is going to ultimately lead, well, it is what is ultimately going to lead to the Civil War. And the Civil War was a war, basically it was the United States against the United States. It was the slave states versus the free states. And we're not going to get into that because it's a whole big, awful, bloody, terrible battle that you guys will learn about like in 8th grade. But that is how Texas became a state. Okay, Texas for a little while was kind of its own little independent territory within the United States before ultimately becoming its own state. Now, for your assignment today, you are going to be going to, there will be a Flipgrid link, and there you will find just a few questions to answer. It basically would be like if I sent you a Google form with questions, but instead of you typing, they're going to be you just verbally providing answers. So make sure you look at the questions that are posted there before you start recording your video. That way you can kind of decide what you want to say and how you want to say it. Okay. Sometimes people find it easier to be detailed when speaking, and other times it's easier for people to be detailed when they're writing. So if you want to write something out before you start talking to make sure you don't forget any points you want to make, then by all means go for it. All right, so that was how Texas became a state and how it fought for its independence. The US is starting to take shape. There are not that many territories left for the US to gain control of before North America looks like kind of how we know it to be today. So we will, well, on Friday, we're not going to be doing an actual lesson. You guys are going to get to play a game, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it's super fun, and I played it and was not very successful. So maybe I'll try again. But okay, go and do this. I cannot wait to hear what you guys have to say on Flipgrid, and I will see you guys later. Bye.